They said it plainly. Everybody will get $2,000. Not a rebate, not a tax credit, a check, cash, direct to Americans. And within hours, millions of people started asking the same question online. Not, how do I spend it? But, is this even real? Because here's the strange part. There's no bill, no vote, no timeline, no official agency confirming anything. Yet people are waiting, refreshing bank apps, scrolling Reddit, asking strangers if they've heard something new. So in this video, we're doing something different. No headlines, no hype clips, no promises. We're going straight to the source. What people are actually being told, what officials are not saying, and why so many Americans are starting to believe this $2,000 check might never arrive. The $2,000 idea didn't start with a bill, a vote, or even a detailed policy outline. It started with a sentence. A short one, simple, powerful. Everybody will get $2,000. That wording is what lit the fuse. On paper, it sounds definitive. Not some households, not eligible taxpayers, not means-tested assistance, just everybody. And that single word is doing a lot of work psychologically. When people hear everybody, they stop asking if they qualify. They stop worrying about income thresholds, filing status, or past tax issues. Their brain skips straight to timing. When does it arrive? Direct deposit or check? That's exactly what happened online. Within hours, clips of the statement were circulating across social media and getting reposted to Reddit. What's important is how fast the assumption formed. People didn't ask, is there legislation? They asked, when does it hit? That tells you something about how deeply previous stimulus checks are baked into public memory. In 2020 and 2021, stimulus payments followed a familiar pattern: announcement, delay, confusion, then eventually money showed up in bank accounts. That sequence trained people to believe that once a number is said out loud by someone in power, the rest is just paperwork. So when the $2,000 figure appeared, many people mentally dropped it into that same category. Another stimulus, another round, another check that would be late but real. But almost immediately, the language started to blur. Some posts called it a stimulus check, others called it a dividend, others referred to it as a tariff refund. And those are not interchangeable things. A stimulus check is emergency spending authorized by Congress. A dividend implies shared profits. A tariff refund suggests money collected elsewhere being returned to citizens. Reddit users were bouncing between all three terms, often in the same thread, trying to piece together what this payment was supposed to be. That confusion got worse when clickbait articles entered the mix. Screenshots of headlines were shared claiming IRS approval, December deposits, or eligibility schedules. When users clicked through, many found vague language, unnamed sources, or outright spam. That led to even more posts asking whether the entire thing was fake. Is this real or spam? Became one of the most common refrains. At the same time, more skeptical voices started pushing back. Some pointed out that no government agency had confirmed anything. Others reminded people that tariffs are paid by consumers, not foreign governments, meaning the idea of a free dividend didn't add up. A few commenters cut straight to the point. There is no check coming. You were lied to. Once the initial excitement wore off, people online did what it always does best. It started asking uncomfortable questions. Not emotional ones, structural ones. The first thing people noticed was what wasn't there. No bill number. Normally when real money is about to move, there's paperwork. A named bill. A reference point. Something you can actually look up. With the $2,000 idea, nobody could point to anything concrete. Users kept asking the same thing in different ways. What's the bill called? Has it been introduced? Is it in the House or the Senate? And every thread ended the same way. Silence. No one had an answer because there wasn't one. That led directly to the next red flag. There was no visible congressional process. No hearings. No committee discussions. No votes scheduled. No lawmakers publicly debating details. For people who remembered how long previous stimulus checks took to pass, this felt off immediately. Even emergency relief during COVID went through months of negotiation. Yet here was a promise of $2,000 per person with zero legislative friction. The people didn't buy that for a second. Then came the absence that really set off alarms. No Treasury confirmation. When stimulus checks are real, the Treasury talks. The IRS publishes guidance. FAQs appear. Portals go live. This time, nothing. No statements. No timelines. No eligibility outlines. And that silence mattered. Multiple. Commenters pointed out that agencies do not quietly prepare mass payments behind the scenes. If the Treasury doesn't acknowledge it, it effectively doesn't exist yet. That's when the tone of the people stating their opinion shifted. The sarcasm started creeping in. One phrase showed up again and again. Checks in the mail. It's an old saying, and people use it as shorthand for false promises. When someone posted asking where the $2,000 was, replies didn't explain policy. They joked, because to them the outcome was already obvious. Others were more blunt. There is no check coming. No hedging. No maybe, just a flat statement. These weren't trolls. Many of them cited past experiences. Promises that sounded confident and generous, then slowly evaporated. Infrastructure weeks, healthcare plans, rebates that never cleared committee. The comparison wasn't subtle. This feels familiar. One reason the $2,000 idea caused so much confusion is simple. People were not even sure what kind of money it was supposed to be. Some people online called it a stimulus check. Others called it a dividend. Others said it was a tariff refund. A stimulus check is something people recognize. It is emergency spending. Congress authorizes it. The Treasury sends it. It shows up as relief during a crisis. That model is burned into memory from the pandemic years. So when people heard $2,000, their brain automatically dropped it into that bucket. Another stimulus, another round of help. But then the word dividend entered the picture, and that changed everything. A dividend sounds different. It implies profit, shared gains. Like citizens are shareholders getting paid because the country made money. That framing matters because it feels earned rather than borrowed. In general, you can see people reacting to that shift immediately. A dividend feels cleaner, less inflationary, less controversial, at least on the surface. Then came tariffs. This is where things started slowing things down and explaining it in plain language. Multiple people pointed out the same basic fact. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments, they are paid by importers, and those costs are passed directly to consumers through higher prices. In other words, tariffs are a tax that shows up at the checkout counter. So, when people heard tariff dividend, a lot of people pushed back. If consumers pay the tariffs, how is returning that money a bonus? You are not getting free cash. You are getting a partial refund on money you already paid through higher prices on goods. Several people boiled it down to one sentence. They are giving you back your own money. Maybe. That distinction mattered because it completely changed expectations. If this were a stimulus, people expected government spending, deficits, and inflation debates. If it were a dividend, people expected a clear funding source and shared benefit. If it were tariff money, people expected higher prices. Somewhere else. But because all three labels were being used interchangeably, expectations became unstable. For example, some Reddit threads reflected that confusion perfectly. One comment would argue inflation would explode. Another would respond that dividends are not inflationary. A third would jump in saying tariffs already caused inflation in the first place. Everyone was technically arguing about different things while using the same $2,000 number. Calling it a dividend also matters politically. A stimulus sounds like help. A dividend sounds like ownership. One implies dependency. The other implies participation. People picked up on that instantly. Some saw the language choice as strategic, a way to sell the idea without triggering the usual backlash against government spending. But language does not replace structure. Even users who liked the idea conceptually kept coming back to the same point. No matter what you call it, money does not move without a mechanism. Dividends still require accounting. Tariff revenue still flows through the Treasury. And nothing about the process had been explained. By this stage, the people in general were no longer asking whether $2,000 sounded good. Almost everyone agreed it did. The real question was simpler. What exactly is this supposed to be? As the conversation dragged on, something became impossible to ignore. No matter how many times the $2,000 was mentioned, no one could point to the step that actually makes a check real. Because legally, a check does not exist just because someone talks about it. Before a single dollar can be sent, a very specific chain has to happen. First, legislation must be written. That means an actual bill with language spelling out who gets paid, how much, when, and from what funding source. That bill has to be introduced, debated, amended, and passed by Congress. Only after that does the Treasury get the authority to act. Until then, there is nothing to execute. That distinction became the core of the skepticism. An announcement is not authorization. Saying money will go out is not the same as legally allowing money to go out. Agencies do not operate on intent or implication. They operate on law. Without a signed piece of legislation, the Treasury cannot prepare payments, the IRS cannot define eligibility, and no systems can be activated. People online started circling this point again and again. They asked for dates. When would it happen? They asked for eligibility rules. Who counts as everybody? They asked for basic confirmation. Which agency is handling this? And every time, the answers were the same. No one knew, because nothing official existed to point to. That absence became louder than any headline. Normally, when real money is coming, something leaks early. A draft bill, a press release, a government FAQ, even vague language from the Treasury saying they are monitoring developments. This time there was nothing. No acknowledgement, no clarification, no correction, just silence. So the questions became more pointed. Has anyone actually received it? Has anyone seen proof? Has any bank processed anything? Those questions repeated endlessly, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly. Entire threads existed just to ask if anyone, anywhere, had seen even a single payment, and every one of those threads ended the same way. No, nothing. That repetition mattered. It showed a shift in mindset. People were no longer debating whether the idea sounded good. They were trying to locate it inside the real financial system. And they couldn't. Some tried to fill the gap with speculation. Maybe it was delayed. Maybe it was being worked on quietly. Maybe it would show up after the holidays. But those theories ran into the same wall. Agencies do not quietly send out trillions of dollars. The paper trail always appears first. Others were more blunt. Without legislation, nothing happens. Period. This is where the $2,000 idea began to feel hollow to many people. Not because the money wouldn't help, but because the process that makes money real was completely missing. No bill, no authority, no mechanism. And that raised an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the most important step was never taken at all. Once it became clear that no official details existed, a different kind of tension took over. Not excitement, anxiety. Because whenever money is promised without rules, people assume the rules will come later. And when rules come later, they usually shrink the group that qualifies. That fear showed up almost immediately. The word everybody sounded great at first, but US citizens have heard this before. Big promises often start broad and then slowly tighten. Income caps appear. Phase-outs get added. Exceptions multiply. So, people began asking the questions that always come next. Do you need to pay taxes to qualify? What's the income cutoff? Is this per person or per household? Will it be taxed back later? Those questions weren't random. They were shaped by experience. Some people worried that only wage earners would qualify. Others asked whether retirees on Social Security would be excluded. Students asked if they counted at all. Disabled individuals wondered if benefit status would disqualify them. And families wanted to know whether everybody meant each adult, each dependent, or just one payment per household. None of those questions had answers. That uncertainty created a familiar pattern. People started preparing themselves for disappointment. They imagined the final version before it even existed. Income limits quietly set just below middle-class earnings. Payments reduced for joint filers. Exclusions justified by technical definitions. Another major concern was clawbacks. Even if the money arrived, would it really be $2,000? Or would it show up now and disappear later through taxes, reduced refunds, or benefit adjustments? US citizens remembered how some previous payments were. Technically advances on tax credits. Helpful in the moment, painful later. That memory made people cautious instead of grateful. The per person versus per household issue caused even more confusion. If two adults live together, is that $4,000 or $2,000? What about children? What about mixed status households? Without clear language, people defaulted to assuming the least generous interpretation. And that assumption wasn't pessimism. It was pattern recognition. The longer details stayed missing, the more people assumed the goalposts would move. Not maliciously, but predictably. Broad promises narrow. Simple ideas get complicated. And everybody quietly becomes some people. What made this worse was the lack of correction. No official voice stepped in to clarify eligibility. No statement reassured retirees, students, or disabled individuals. Silence filled the gap, and silence tends to breed worst-case scenarios. At this stage, belief fractured. Some people still hoped the promise would remain clean and universal. Others had already mentally written themselves out of eligibility, and many hovered in between, waiting for rules that never came. The $2,000 was no longer just about money. It became a test of trust. Not trust in whether help would be offered, but trust in whether it would quietly disappear once definitions were written, and without answers that trust keeps slipping. Even as skepticism grew, belief didn't disappear. And that's the part that matters most, because for many US citizens, $2,000 isn't a political talking point. It's psychological relief. It's breathing room. It's 1 month where the math finally works. That's why the idea refused to die. People didn't talk about buying luxuries. They talked about catching up, paying rent without juggling dates, fixing a car that's been limping along for months, covering a medical bill before it gets sent to collections. For some, it was simply about not falling further behind. Again and again, the same sentiment surfaced. It's not a lot to some people, but it would change my month. That sentence explains more than any policy debate ever could. For households living paycheck to paycheck, $2,000 represents stability, not surplus. It doesn't solve structural problems, it doesn't erase debt, but it interrupts the constant pressure. And when pressure becomes the default state, even a brief pause feels life-changing. That's also why so many people kept bringing up old stimulus checks. Some shared stories about never receiving payments they were eligible for years ago. Others talked about checks that got lost, misdirected, or stuck in administrative limbo. People described calling hotlines that never connected, filing forms that went nowhere, and being told deadlines had passed despite doing everything right. Those experiences created a strange mix of hope and resignation. On one hand, people knew how unreliable the system could be. On the other, the idea that something was still owed to them made the $2,000 feel like unfinished business. Not a new gift, but a delayed correction. That emotional framing kept the belief alive even when logic said otherwise. Financial stress also distorts time. When money is tight, the future collapses into the present. Planning becomes survival. That's why many people weren't asking whether the policy made sense long term. They were asking whether help might arrive before the next bill was due. In that context, uncertainty hurts more than bad news. A clear no would at least allow people to adjust expectations. Silence keeps hope suspended, and suspended hope is exhausting. Some US citizens acknowledged this openly. They said they knew it probably wasn't real, but they couldn't afford to fully dismiss it. Letting go felt like giving up the last possible lifeline. So they checked again, and again. Not because they believed blindly, but because they needed the possibility to stay alive a little longer. That's why the question never fully shifted from, is this real? To, this is fake. It hovered in between, in that uncomfortable space where belief and doubt coexist. The $2,000 became symbolic, not just of money, but of whether the system ever shows up when people need it most. And as long as that question remained unanswered, people kept watching. As much as many US citizens wanted the $2,000 to be real, a different concern kept surfacing alongside the hope. Inflation. Not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. People didn't need economists to explain it to them. They had already felt it. Grocery bills doubling, rent climbing faster than wages, insurance premiums jumping without explanation. So when the idea of another mass payment entered the conversation, some immediately asked a hard question. What happens next? The comparison to previous stimulus rounds came up almost automatically. After the pandemic checks went out, prices surged, not overnight, but steadily. And while there is still debate about how much stimulus contributed versus supply chains or corporate pricing, many people connect those dots emotionally. Money was injected, prices rose, life got more expensive. That sequence is burned into memory. So for some, the $2,000 didn't look like relief. It looked like a delay, a temporary cushion followed by higher costs that would quietly eat it back. This is where the idea of invisible harm entered the discussion. Inflation doesn't arrive as a bill in the mail. It shows up later, spread out, disguised. You feel it at the checkout line, in rent renewals, in subscription prices that creep upward, and because it's diffuse, it's easy to miss in the moment. But people remembered how quickly stimulus money evaporated last time once prices adjusted. That led to an uncomfortable position for some US citizens. They could personally use the $2,000 right now, but they worried it would make things worse overall. Especially for people on fixed incomes, retirees, or anyone without leverage to negotiate higher wages. So opposition didn't always come from ideology. Sometimes it came from caution. There were also questions about funding. If the money wasn't clearly coming from existing revenue, would it be deficit financed? Would it involve monetary expansion? Would it quietly feed into the same cycle that drove previous price increases? Without transparency, people filled in the blanks with past experience. Others took the argument one step further. Even if the check helped in the short term, would landlords, lenders, and corporations simply adjust prices upward again? Would the relief be absorbed before it ever reached quality of life? That fear made some people reject the idea entirely, even though they were struggling themselves. What's notable is how balanced many of these concerns were. This wasn't framed as help is bad. It was framed as help has side effects, and ignoring those side effects feels irresponsible when people are already stretched thin. By this stage, the conversation had matured. It was no longer just about whether the $2,000 was real. It was about whether it would actually help, or whether it would repeat a cycle people were still paying for. And that's why the debate became quieter, more cautious, less excitement, more calculation. Hope was still there, but it was tempered by memory. At this point, after weeks of speculation, debate, hope, and skepticism, the question becomes unavoidable. Is the $2,000 check actually coming? Right now, there are a few things we can say with certainty. First, no one can confirm it. There is no official documentation showing a payment has been authorized. No bill has been introduced that lays out the details. No government agency has acknowledged preparations for mass distribution. That is not interpretation. That is simply the current state of reality. Second, there is no mechanism yet. Money does not move through vibes or promises. It moves through systems. Those systems require laws, funding instructions, eligibility rules, and operational timelines. None of that exists publicly. Until it does, the check is an idea, not an event. That leads to the most important distinction of all. Headlines are not authority. Headlines can repeat claims. Clips can go viral. Articles can speculate. But institutions speak through action, not implication. When money is real, institutions prepare visibly. They publish guidance. They clarify eligibility. They manage expectations. Silence from those institutions is not neutral. It is informative. And right now, that silence is loud. What would actually have to change for the $2,000 to become real is very specific. A bill would need to be written and introduced. That bill would need to pass Congress. It would need to clearly define who qualifies, how payments are funded, whether the money is taxable, and how distribution works. Only after that, would agencies be legally allowed to move forward? None of those steps are optional. None of them can be skipped. That's why so many people have settled on the same conclusion, even if they arrived there reluctantly. This feels like hype before excuses. The pattern is familiar. Big promise, simple number, confident language, then delay, then clarification, then narrowing definitions, then blame shifting, then silence, and finally, quiet abandonment. Not with a cancellation, but with attention moving elsewhere. That doesn't mean the idea could never become real. It means that right now, it isn't. Some US citizens are holding out hope that pressure will force action, that public expectation will turn words into policy. Others believe the moment has already passed, and the lack of follow-through says everything. What unites both sides is clarity about one thing. If the check were truly imminent, the system would already be talking. And it isn't. So the honest answer today is not exciting. It's not dramatic. But it's accurate. There is no confirmation. There is no mechanism. And there is no timeline. Until that changes, the $2,000 check exists only as a promise, and promises, without structure, have a history of fading quietly out of view. Which raises the final question. If this isn't about the money anymore, what is it really about? By the time the $2,000 question reached this stage, something deeper had shifted. The debate was no longer really about a check. It was about trust. For many US citizens, financial promises no longer trigger excitement. They trigger analysis, scrutiny, a quiet tightening in the chest that says, let's see what's missing. That reaction didn't come from cynicism. It came from repetition. Over the past decade, people have watched the same cycle play out again and again. Big numbers announced with confidence. Simple language meant to reassure. Then a long gap. Then caveats. Then revisions. Then nothing. Not always loudly. Cancelled, just slowly forgotten. When you see that enough times, hope stops feeling safe. That's why the initial reaction to the $2,000 wasn't celebration. It was investigation. People didn't wait for official reassurance. They went looking for structure. They searched for bills, timelines, eligibility rules, and institutional signals. When they didn't find them, skepticism followed naturally. Not because people don't want help, but because they've learned how to spot when help isn't actually on the way. This is also where online communities matter. When information is fragmented, people compare notes. Someone notices a missing detail. Someone else confirms it's missing everywhere. Another person checks agency statements. Another pulls up past examples. Together they form a rough but surprisingly accurate picture of reality long before official narratives settle. That's why so many US citizens trust these discussions more than press statements. Press releases are polished. They repeat claims without testing them. Headlines are designed to capture attention, not to verify mechanisms. Online threads, for all their noise, do something different. They ask, where is the paperwork? Where is the process? Where is the proof? When none of that appears, the conclusion doesn't feel emotional. It feels logical. This doesn't mean institutions are always lying. It means they often speak in intent before structure exists. And people have learned that intent without structure rarely turns into outcomes. The $2,000 conversation became a case study in that awareness. Not in outrage, not in conspiracy, but in collective pattern recognition. People didn't need insider information. They just compared what was being said to what usually happens when money is real, and what they saw didn't match. The calm realization that followed is important. It wasn't panic, it wasn't anger, it was acceptance. If something changes, it will show itself clearly. If it doesn't, there is nothing to wait for. That mindset marks a shift. US citizens are no longer reacting to promises. They are waiting for systems to move, and until they do, words stay words. So if there is one lesson from the $2,000 moment, it's this. Hope isn't gone. It's just conditional now. It waits for evidence. And that might be the most rational response left.